Okay, so today's daf yomi is Bava Metzia daf samachay Bava Metzia 65. Today's daf yomi, we're going to actually it's daf samachlav, it's 66, but we're going to start on the bottom of samachay on the base 65b, 4 lines from the bottom. The daf yomi is dedicated for a shmira for Am Yisrael, tzala for the shvuyim, Yeshua for the chayalim. So the Daf Yomi tells us, so who Gavra talks about a case where there was a man, that he said, I'm going to sell you my property, but he explicitly states that I'm not promising you anything, I'm not guaranteeing you anything if the property in the end is, if somebody else comes along, a creditor comes along and claims the property. He saw that the buyer was upset. He was sad. He wasn't happy with this arrangement. So he wanted to try and make him feel better. Why are you sad? If they'll seize the property from you, Magbino Chashufra, I'm going to give you a better property. I'm going to give you a choice property. And not only that, I'm going to give you all the improvements you put into the property. I'll make you whole, and I'll give you the fruits that you would have lost. Basically, I'm going to give you a good piece of land, and I'm going to give you the properties, and I'm going to be make it good for you. So under these circumstances, on top of Samach Vav Amud Aleph, Gemara says, Pitume Milei Ba'almahu. These types of promises are not real promises. We don't take them seriously. He's just trying to comfort him, but it's not real. And Amrle Rav Ashi Hamemer, so Rav Ashi says to Hamemer, what's the reason behind this ruling? We don't know. It's not a brisa, but and it's not a tribute to anybody. It's just a case which Rav Ashi and Amimar were discussing. What's the reason? Because typically speaking, who's the one who would make this type of condition? The purchaser. And now, in this case, who's the one who's making the condition? The seller. So therefore, since it's the opposite, therefore we're going to say, therefore you're saying, says Rav Ashi Tamimar, which means that this was a statement that Amimar was reporting. So therefore we're saying that it's just words, but it's not real because the statement was made by the seller when it should have been made by the purchaser. But then how does that agree with the brisa that we cited in yesterday's daf? Dikatani Amasmith on the brisa, Dikatani, which stated with Shiucha Mos that the buyer said to the seller, when you have money, when you have money, I'll return the field to you. Mutter. That's permitted to do so because, and the reason is because it's not binding. So therefore, meaning to say that the buyer says, when you have money, I'll return it to you. He doesn't have to return it. Because who's the one who's supposed to say it? Because the seller is the one who is supposed to have made that statement that that you'll have to return the field to me. But in the case, but in this case, in this case, the seller was supposed to have made this conditional clause, but he didn't make it. The buyer is the one who made this conditional clause. And so we say, Va'amrinan, and a Maimer said about this, Maishna Resha, Maishna Seif. And a Maimer said, what's the reason why there's a distinction between the first case of the brisa, where the seller was the one who made the conditional clause, and that it's prohibited because we're going to say that could become a form of interest where you have to sell it back to the seller. And in the last clause, the buyer made it, it's permitted. Amar Rava, and Rava explained that the difference is Seifa de Amar Midaite, that in the last case, it's where the buyer said it, that he's going to consider it. He didn't say he's going to for sure do it. And so that's the reason why it's not binding. And time of the Amar Midaite, the reason why it's not binding is because he says, I'm not required to do it. But if he had said that that it's not conditional, but he's for sure going to do it. If he had said, I'm for sure going to do it, we wouldn't say it was just words. We would say he definitely, it's binding. And so therefore we see from here that even though the buyer makes the statement, it's going to be completely binding. So the Gemara says, no, in this case, the buyer is not the one making the statement. Meaning to say that it's as though he had said, he hasn't said, when the buyer says this, it's just as though he said it. It's as though he had said that it's dependent upon him. But really, it's just pitume milia ba'amahu, because really the seller is the one who's supposed to have made this stipulation. But since the buyer said it, since he said he's willing to do it, we're saying it as though he said it. But really, he's not the one who said it. Meaning to say, look, Rashi says, this is what Rava said. What's the difference in the first case and the first case? So Rava says the seifa in the latter case, it's given the buy mocher isnuye, because the seller wants to make the conditional clause, v'lo asni, and he didn't make it, and the purchaser said it on his own. Then we're saying it, we're viewing it as though nasik only midaite achsarine. It's as though he's saying to him, if I want, I'll return it to you. Even though he didn't explicitly say it, it's as though he said it. And the seller can't force him. So therefore, even if he would return it now, is basically we're basically saying it was implicit in his statement. So now the Gemara goes to the next case. So there was a person who was about to die. He was very sick. The cause of Lagito et Vesayo, and he writes a get to his wife. And in Gidve Isnach. So while he was very sick, he groaned, and so basically, this person is very sick. While he's very sick, he writes a get to his wife. Why is he writing the get? Because presumably he doesn't want to end up becoming an aguna, because if he would die and she would fall to Yibum with his brother, and maybe the brother wasn't around, she might end up as an aguna. And so, because she requires chalitz, or else she can't remarry. So therefore, since he had to give her the get, while he's giving it to her, he doesn't want to do it. So in Gid ve'isnach, he groans and he sighs. So Amraway, she says to him, "Amai kamas nachas." She says to him, "Why are you signing? Ikayamta didach ana. If you live, then I'll be with you, and I'm not going to be divorced." And then he gave her the get, and then he recovered. So Amar Zvid pitume mila ba'amahu, meaning to say, her statement that says that that if you don't die, I'm going to remain with you. That's not considered binding. It's just considered like mere words. So Amalei Rav Achami Difta or Ravina. So Rav Achami Difta says to Ravina, wait 1 second. Let's say it was actually real. It wasn't just mere words, but she had said it's like, legally speaking, I want this to be binding. Is that really going to be applicable? Does she have the right? Does she have the right to make these conditions on a get? It's the husband who's the one who can give the get. The wife can't put a condition on the get, only the husband. So even if it was not just mere words, it wouldn't have been binding. So the Gemara says, no, Ma'u de Tema, you might have thought to say, Hu Gufe Adaita Didaka Gamer V'Yav Gita. You might have said that the husband himself, Hu Gufe, after he heard what she said, Adaita Didaka Gamer V'Yav Gita. On the basis of what she said, he decided to give the get. And so Kamash once or Zvid says, no, that's not the case. That her speech was just mere words, and he didn't decide to give the get on that condition. So now we go to the next part of the Mishnah. And now we're going to introduce the concept of an asmachta. Asmachta is basically that you say you agreed to something, but the outcome was not what you really meant to that you didn't really expect this outcome when you agreed to it. So the Gemara says the following. Our Mishnah had said, if you lend money and you take back a field as a collateral, and you say to the person, if you don't, when the person gives you the loan, you say, I'm giving you my field as a collateral. If you don't return the field to me within 3 years, if I don't pay you back within 3 years, then you get to keep it. Amar Afuna, B'shas Mata Matos, if they make this agreement at the time where he gives him the money, Kana call. Then if the borrower indeed does not pay back the money, the lender acquires everything, even if it's worth much more than the loan. But let's say they make this agreement well after they gave the money. Then the lender only has acquired the amount of the field corresponding to the loan that he lent. Rav Nachman Amar, afilu la'achar matamos kanako. Even Rav Nachman says, even if he makes this agreement well after the money was given, the lender acquires the whole field. And so the Gemara says, but hold on one second. So Avad Rav Nachman Uvda Gabe Reish Kulusa. So Rav Nachman, basically, he says his ruling that even if you make this agreement after the money was given, he's still it's still going to be binding. So the Gemara says that one time Rav Nachman made such a ruling, Gabe Reish Kulusa, in the house of the Reish Kulusa. He was his son-in-law. Kari Rav Yehuda Ashtari. When Rav Yehuda, when he saw Rav Nachman's contract where he says that the borrower has agreed to give him the whole property if he doesn't return within a certain amount of time, he tore it up. Amalei Reish Kulusa, Rav Yehuda Kari Ashtarich. So the Reish Kulusa said to Rav Nachman, Rav Yehuda tore up your document. Amalei. So Rav Nachman said, Dardika Kare. Was it a child that tore it up? Gava Rabba Kare. It was a great man that tore it up. Chazi time of Ikari. So Rav Nachman was the Av Bezdin. He said, listen, it wasn't just some child who tore it up. It was a great man. So we have to see what was wrong with my reasoning that allowed him to tear it up. Alternatively, Amarle, the Rav Nachman said to the Reish Kulusa, Dardika Kari. It was a child that tore it up. Tekuyamo Gabe Didi Bedina de Dardikinina. Because everyone compared to me is like a child in matters of deen, in matters of the civil law. And so therefore, clearly it's not the case that I be wrong and this person will be right. Hadam Rav Nachman, but then we see that Rav Nachman says, he retracts his position. Afilu b'shas matamos. The Nachman totally changed his position. Even if the matter was made during the time, even if this agreement was made that you can get my property if I don't pay back, even if it was made at the time of the loan, he has not acquired everything. So the Gemara seems to say that what's the reason? The reasoning here is because it's an asmachta. And since it's an asmachta, it's basically this idea that you're only saying that so that you can get the loan, but you don't really mean it. And so therefore, it's not going to be binding. So H.A. Rava Rav Nachman, so Rava challenges Rav Nachman. It says explicitly in the Mishnah that if you don't give it to me from now within 3 years, then the field won't be mine. Harei shalo, that'll be his. Meaning to say, we see it is binding. So Amalei ani omer asmachta kanya, umanyume omer asmachta lo kanya. And so Rav Nachman's response to this was, I used to say that it is binding because it's an asmachta, and I say that an asmachta is a valid way of conducting a transaction. But Minyumi argues with me, and Minyumi caused me to retract my position. And this case here is a case of a promise. It's an asmachta that's relying on these words, and Minyumi convinced me that it shouldn't be binding. And so therefore, he's the one I'm not going to try to explain the Mishnah. It's Menyumi's responsibility to explain the Mishnah because he says an asmachta is not binding, and from our Mishnah it says it is binding. So the Gemara says, okay, fine. So it's a question on Menyumi. Well, Menyumi kashi masnisin. So how does Menyumi explain our Mishnah? So the Gemara says, I'll explain to you how Menyumi will explain our Mishnah. If you want, you could say Masnisin Rabbi Yossi. If you want, you could say our Mishnah follows the position of Rabbi Yossi, who says Asmachta is Kanya. Rabbi Yossi says in Bava Metzia that Asmachta is binding, but we rule it's not. That's what Menyumi would say. On top of Samach Vavam and Alf, Samach Vavam and Beis, Ibayasema, or alternatively, it's not an Asmachta because he says Darmai Kani Me'achshav. He says acquired from the field right now, meaning to say. He says, you're requiring it right now, but if you pay me back within 3 years, you don't have the field. So therefore, it's not like it gets rid of the asmachta problem because he says you actually own the field right now. So the Gemara says, Amrule Mar Yenuko Mar Kashisha B'nei de Rav Chisda or Rav Ashi. So Mar Yenuka Mar Kashisha, the sons of Rav Chisda. So Rav Chisda had 2 sons, Rashi says, in Ksubos, who had the same name. And so therefore, both of them were called Mar. But to distinguish between them, he called one the Yanuka, one the younger one, and one the Kashisha, one the older one. So Mar Yanuka and Mar Kashisha, the children of Rav Chisda, said to Rav Ashi, Hachi Amri Nardai Mishmei Rav Nachman. This is what the Nardai say in the name of Rav Nachman, Haya Smachta Biz Menei Kanya, below Zimnei Lo Kanya. Meaning to say, when it comes to an Asmachta, if you do it at the proper time, it's going to be valid, but if not at the proper time, it's not valid. What does that mean? Meaning to say, it means, presumably this means that if the lender if the borrower is not paid off by that time, then it's binding. But if he has paid it off, it's not binding. Amru kol midi bizmani kani, meaning to say everything is only binding at that time. Below Zmani Lokani. So what does that mean? Of course, everything is only binding in its time. Gemara says, Dilma Hachikamri. So this is what it means. If a borrower had agreed to give up his field if he defaulted by a certain date, and he met the lender, he met him within the time, and he says, acquire the field, meaning to say, I'm not going to buy it. Within 3 years, I'm not going to pay you the money. Kani, then he does acquire the field. But if he met him after the time and he says acquire it, then lo kani, he doesn't acquire. My timer, machmas kisufa huda ka'amrei. Meaning to say that the only reason why he's telling him after the fact you acquired the field is because he's embarrassed. But he never really intended to give up the field. Velohi. But it's not the case. Even if he met him within the time, it's not acquired because why? Because the reason why he says you can acquire it is because he thinks to himself, when the time comes to arrive, I don't want him to come and bother me. So therefore, I'm just going to say it. So therefore he says it. So the Gemara says, Amar Papa, Haya Smachta, Zimnin Kanya, Zimnin Lo Kanya. This is Smachta, sometimes it's binding, something is not binding. Let's say on the date where he's supposed to pay the money, he finds the borrower drinking the beer, Kani, then we're going to say he's acquired it. Because basically the borrower was not nervous that he's going to be foreclosed on his property. But if he finds them searching for the money, then it does work. Lo kani. Then under those circumstances, he's not acquired it because the person was clearly looking to try to undo the foreclosure, so clearly never intended for him to get his field. Maybe he saw him in the bar because he's drinking because he's about to lose his property. Or maybe he got somebody else. He has a mortgage broker going out there looking for a way for him to raise the money. Ravina says, "Ikapid bidmei vadekani." Basically, if the borrower is very kapid, he's very particular about anything that he has for sale, and so therefore he can't sell the money to sell the properties to raise the field. Vadaikani, then he certainly can get the field because that shows he's ready before cause because he's not selling it off his properties. Amrway, Ravachami Difto or Ravina, but Dilma Savar Kiechidlo Tidzol Are. Maybe he thinks that he has to not sell off his properties at a fire sale because he also doesn't want his land to go down. If he refuses to sell any of his land, then for sure we're going to say he clearly wasn't hustling to save his property, suddenly acquired. Even though the rabbis say if you're doing a smach, it doesn't work. The field nevertheless becomes a mortgage, so a specific mortgage which he can collect his money from. Meaning to say he can't get back the extra money, but he can get he can acquire at least the amount that he's owed from the property. Did the borrower say to the lender that you could acquire it for your debt? It's not a specific mortgage. It's not an apoteki. So Amoy Marzucha Bereder Ravina V'Yamar Kani Migbe Mine Kani. So Asmachti Vasmachta Lokanya. So Marzucha, the son of Ramar, said to Ravina, but if he said, get the field to collect the debt, would he really be able to acquire it? In the end, it's in a smachta, and a smachta is lokanya. Oh, apoteki damar papa mahi. What's this apoteki which our papa spoke about? The amar away. Peron el mizu. He said, basically, what he's saying, the borrower says to the lender, this is the property. Only from this property are you able to collect from. So there was a man who sold the land to another man, Bachrayas, and he sold it to him with a guarantee. Amarway, he said to him, Itarfu leiminai. He says to him, so a man sells another property with a guarantee, and he says to him, Itarfu leiminai, if one of your creditors comes and seizes the property from me, magvisli me ide idis islach. Then will you give to me from the best of your properties? I'm not going to give to you from the best of my properties, but to make them come because I want those. I'm going to give to you from basically other properties, not the best, but other good properties. In the end, they did in fact seize the field from the buyer, and also Badka Shako Ide Idis. And then a flood came and wiped out the best of its best property of the seller. Savra Papa, Memar Meidus Amarway. So he says, okay, can we get from the number 2 property? He said, yeah, you can. That's what Papa thought. So Amar Vachami Dito Ravina, Vawamer way. No, let the seller say, but so Rav Achav Difti said, no, when I said you can get from the best and not the best of the best, that's when I had a best of the best. But now my best is the best of the best. So therefore, I don't have to give it to you. I can give you one lower down. Rav Bar Shaba Avamasik pay Rav Kahana Zuzi. Rav Bar Shaba owed some money to Rav Kahana. He says, if I don't pay you by this date, collect from this one. Papa thought to say, when do I say that a smach is not binding by land? Because typically land is not sold. But wine is sold, so it's just like a commodity, it's just money. Anytime you say if, it's not binding. You don't really mean it. Now that the rabbi said that if you have an asmach that's not binding, we're going to give the land back and all the produce back. It's all going to go back to the borrower. It's all going to go back. The Savar of Nachman, Mechila B'Tal is Lo Ave Mechila. So we see from here that if you make a waiver, a mechila, by mistake, it's not a waiver. But how could that be the case? If somebody sells a palm tree to his friend, before the produce comes into existence, the seller can cancel it. But once it comes in, he can't undo it. Rav Nachman says even after it comes into existence, you can undo it. I will admit that once the purchaser has taken it out and eaten it, then at that point you can't undo it. So the Gemara says, "Hasam Sabine Hava." No, in the case of the palm tree, we're dealing with a sale. That's a distinction. Here we're dealing with a loan. In the case of a sale, there a waiver that's mistaken is effective. But in the case of a loan, you have to return it because otherwise it's ribis. Okay, we'll stop here. This is the daf for Shabbos, and we'll do it in person on Shabbos. Shkoyach.